Hello and welcome to today's Worksafe Month webinar, WHS Governance, Building Culture, Capability and Compliance. I'm Stephanie Morawski from Worksafe Tasmania and I will be your moderator. Before we start, please take a moment to read the following slide about information received today. I'll now go over housekeeping. Here is a screenshot of the attendee control panel. You should see something that looks like this in the right hand of your screen. You're likely listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to listen over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Webcams and audience microphones will not be used in today's presentation. Questions will be taken throughout today's presentation. Please use your control panel to type and submit your questions. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your presenters, Alicia, Leis and Alison Merridew from WLF Accounting and Advisory. Alicia is an Audit Assurance and Advisory Partner at WLF Accounting and Advisory. Alicia has spent 20 years of experience in the audit and consulting environments, including governance, risk management, due diligence, process reviews and special investigations. Alicia is well regarded in the public, private and not-for-profit sectors for her ability to understand and add value to her client base. She is considered a trusted advisor to various executive teams and has facilitated many strategic and risk planning workshops where she has navigated through the detail to reach a targeted consensus on strategic matters. Alicia won the Telstra Business Woman of the Year award in the corporate and private category in 2016, demonstrating the impact her work has on her client base. Specifically in relation to work health and safety, WHS, Alicia has led audits of WHS governance processes for clients involved in high-risk work and is an independent member of the Audit and Risk Committee for a large construction business. Alison is a consultant at WLF Accounting and Advisory. Alison works with the public sector clients in areas of risk identification and management, process effectiveness, compliance and policy development. Alison's experience at WLF includes the development of the strategic risk registers, compliance management frameworks, policy grants management processes, policy frameworks, business continuity and incident and emergency plans, grants management processes, privacy and information security frameworks, and facilitation of legislation reviews. Alison has always enjoyed solving problems and finding ways to do better things. She has previously worked in legal practice, law reform, scientific research, professional yachting and gymnastics coaching. Alison also has over 10 years experience as a volunteer surf lifesaver, including North Bondi, New South Wales. Alison draws on these experiences and perspectives to inform a practical approach to safety and risk management to build strong relationships with diverse groups of people and to identify opportunities for innovation and improvement. Welcome, Alicia and Alison.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everybody. Alicia speaking first this afternoon, and thanks so much for tuning into this session. Alison and I are hoping to obviously talk to you today about work health and safety governance, including the issues of building culture, capability and compliance in organisations. And we're bringing, I guess, a perspective based on a number of work health and safety governance reviews we've done within our client base, which stretches across small not-for-profits all the way up to complex, large corporations and government. And so on the way through today, we're more than happy to take your questions as we work through it, and we hope that it gives you some practical insights into some of the issues that organisations are facing with work health and safety governance. So just kicking off in terms of what the definition of governance actually is. So if you think about governance, the definition of governance is the systems and processes used by an organisation. So pausing on that, systems and processes is not always what people think about with governance. They think about roles and responsibilities and boards and senior executives, but we're actually talking about the systems and processes used by an organisation to direct its course and control its affairs. And then we're talking about activities and behaviours to ensure that the organisation's objectives are met, performance is optimised and risk is controlled. So if you think about governance in terms of work health and safety, today we want to talk to you about the systems and processes that an organisation can use to direct the course in relation to work health and safety and to control the activities of the organisation in a compliant way in accordance with work health and safety legislation, and ensure that the activities and behaviours of the organisation ensure that you're doing your best and you can meet the objectives, which is to keep our people safe. So in terms of overall governance, if we're doing work with an organisation in relation to, I guess, the key pillars of governance, we really talk to organisations about strategy, oversight and compliance, risk and financial accountability as the key pillars to governance. And again, if you apply that to work health and safety, today we want to cover aspects about strategy for work health and safety, oversight, compliance, risk management. And then financial accountability is really about how much resource and investment are we applying to our work health and safety systems. Okay, so we'll cover off a few things today. I'm covering off two aspects and Alison one, so we will move into the first part. And that is the requirement under the Act around due diligence. And I want you to think about due diligence as corporate governance applied to work health and safety. So if you think about corporate governance as we've just described it, to undertake due diligence, it's really important that the organisation and the senior people of an organisation, be it the board, the senior executives, and the officers and PCBU under the Act, take reasonable steps to acquire knowledge, make decisions and verify performance. And in our discussions with a lot of organisations, while they can indicate how they manage hazards and incidents, how they assess workplace activities, to actually come back up a step and say, how do we apply due diligence? How do we apply corporate governance to work health and safety and ensure that the right people are acquiring knowledge, making decisions and verifying performance, and ensuring that we have systems and processes in place to make sure that happens. So when I work with boards, these are the steps we talk about. Are we engaged, inquisitive and challenging? And do we have a knowledge of our legal obligations? In speaking with a lot of boards, and particularly those that have volunteer type boards, when we say to them, what are your obligations as a director? They can talk in sort of vague concepts, but don't have a very strong idea or knowledge of those legal obligations. So interestingly, at that due diligence level, it's how does an organisation ensure that the people who are in senior roles have that knowledge of their legal obligations. So due diligence, if we're going to effectively apply due diligence under the Act to our organisation, we need lead as well as lag performance indicators. So we need to be thinking about how am I going to acquire knowledge? How am I going to think broadly about the organisation's overall approach to work health and safety? And if all I'm getting is statistics after the event about the number of hazards we've received or the number of incidents we've had, we're really not thinking about broadly enough around acquiring knowledge on our organisations and the sectors or industries that we're operating in. I also talk to directors about not being able to delegate those responsibilities, and I think that's really important as we begin to talk about governance today, that senior people understand that you cannot delegate the need to inquire or have knowledge. You cannot delegate the need to make decisions and verify performance to others. So we've had a number of WHS governance reviews where we've gone to the organisation and we speak to senior members and they say, oh yeah, no, all good, Work Health and Safety Committee handles that. Very clear under the Act that you cannot delegate and have no understanding yourself of these particular issues and obligations. And of course, under the Act, providing the highest level of protection as is reasonably practicable. So the key elements, if you look at work health and safety governance, these are the things that we would suggest to you as a bit of a checklist and framework around some of the aspects that you might think about with work health and safety governance. So if we go in with an organisation and start talking to them about work health and safety governance, we are not talking about what decisions they've made at the operational level to manage a particular hazard or risk in the workplace. We're not talking about looking at task descriptions and the mitigations and PPE. We are talking about these elements in an organisation. So how does this organisation structure the governance? Escalation, consultation committees, reporting and minutes. How does it handle risk management and compliance? How does it manage the policy framework and the training and the policies and procedures? How does it ensure that its due diligence requirements are being met? And the last one there is, how does the organisation understand the culture of the organisation and how people are being transparent about their activities and how they're going about them and how they're held accountable for those particular actions. So going back to our definition, we're looking, when we come in and say what is work health and safety governance, it's the systems and processes that underpin these activities. We quite often talk to clients and we say, if it's not documented or if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So for an investigation, if your organisation is investigated under a work health and safety matter, it's so important that your organisation is able to demonstrate that you have had those critical elements of governance in place that underpins your whole commitment to your work health and safety systems. So let me move on to work health and safety governance, which is the first pillar under that. So we've got 5 elements there: escalation, consultation committees, reporting and minutes. I think we really just want to highlight a couple of things there to you in terms of that governance brackets. And one is the clarity of the roles and responsibility between the PCBU and officers and the PCBU and committees. So this is a common finding. In fact, I think in pretty much all the reviews that we've done, we're always commenting to organisation about having further clarity on the roles and responsibilities. So what is the role and responsibility of the PCBU and how do they undertake that role versus the role and responsibility of the officers, or likewise the role and responsibility of various committees. Now, depending on the size of your organisation and the complexity of your work health and safety arrangements, if you're a large organisation, you may have multiple committees. So you may have some kind of consultation structure which enables you to consult across your organisation in relation to work health and safety matters. You may have work health and safety in your operational line management structure and some of your management team meetings. And you may also have higher level work health and safety committees which are supporting either the board or the executives in their role. So in terms of that, who is covering off on what is actually really, really important. And so quite often we'll see that maybe a particular work health and safety hazard or incident is escalated through that structure, but it's not clear who, for example, we'll talk about a bit later, is signing off that the whole work health and safety framework is appropriate. So clarity of roles and responsibilities really assists your organisation in making sure that everyone can do those roles effectively. The second point there is about who's responsible for the doing bit and who's accountable being the oversight bit. So again, quite often in work health and safety, we see organisations do a lot of doing and a lot of activity, but very, very little clarity in the governance structure about who is sitting back oversighting the activities. So I'll give you an example there. If you have a hazard and incident register, you should have in that hazard and incident register what has been the response, the management response to that particular hazard or incident, and signing that off. And a lot of you, no doubt, who are using electronic systems will have some kind of closeout process to say that that hazard or incident has been closed and addressed. The question then is, who has oversight over that in terms of, was that an appropriate response? And that's really important regardless of how big or small your organisation is, to clearly identify who is responsible versus who has the oversight. The third point there is useful, effective reporting. In terms of governance, for us, we see a lot of reporting which is statistics based. So, for example, the number of hazards that have been logged, the number of incidents that have occurred, the turnover statistics for your workforce, etc., etc. However, in terms of useful, effective reporting to really identify the key underlying issues, it's really about lead and lag indicators, as I mentioned before. It's about providing insights in terms of what are the underlying drivers of some of these particular issues that are occurring, and potentially some trends. So are we seeing some linkages between the hazards that are identified or the incidents that are occurring? The other one too is, how do we make sure that we have useful, effective reporting for significant issues that fall outside of our normal organisational reporting frameworks? So how do we make sure that people in senior roles, particularly PCBUs and officers, receive reporting in the right time frame to make sure that they understand significant issues? So if you have a look at your reporting, it's really good to challenge that reporting and say, is that reporting helping the senior people in our organisation actually understand what our underlying work health and safety risks are, potential issues, and is it helping them make decisions rather than just giving them statistics? And the last one there under governance is how to set up effective signing off processes. The research tells us that when people have to put their name to something and have to sign something, they are more likely to undertake that task with focus and with commitment. So if the work health and safety system does not require anybody to sign off that they have understood their role, or it doesn't require anyone to sign off to say that they have implemented the policies and procedures effectively within the organisation, you're going to get a different level of commitment or understanding of those particular policies and procedures. So escalated sign-off regimes can develop real behaviour and attitude changes within your organisation, and changes to commitment in relation to understanding what the policies and procedures of the organisation. The other one there is the signing off process in relation to closing out issues, and I think the biggest issue we see there is really not having the evidence that anything has actually changed when we've closed off hazards or incidents. We've signed them off, which is appropriate, but we haven't actually seen the evidence that the underlying issue has been addressed. So in terms of roles, just briefly, I just want to really highlight the top one there in relation to PCBU and officers. Again, bringing it up to that work health and safety governance level. It's really at that level that we're talking about making sure that those people understand their need to do due diligence to ensure that the organisation is complying with the requirements of the Act. Have they taken steps to inform themselves that the organisation has all the elements in place? And do they clearly understand their duties to workers and others who engage with the organisation under the Act? So we tend to find in the work health and safety systems and structures that we look at that managers, supervisors and line workers are quite clear about their roles in work health and safety. And while PCBUs and officers, executives and boards do have a broad understanding, when you actually start to dig down and say, and what steps have you taken under the due diligence requirements, it gets a little bit more grey and a little bit more fluffy. So useful sometimes just to have simple diagrams like that one to help people understand their roles within the organisation. And the last one there, if you use a simple RACI analysis for work health and safety governance, this can be quite an effective tool to actually sit down and say, okay, let's have a look at this. Who is accountable in our organisation for the oversight and control aspects, and who is responsible? And that can be quite an effective tool for you to really work out in your organisation and ensure those people fully comprehend what their responsibilities are under the Act. Okay. So I hope that was a useful sort of outline about the governance aspects in terms of creating a system and a process and a structure whereby those elements of the work health and safety part are well managed. Just want to move on to work health and safety compliance. And there's probably three aspects here with compliance and that we want to talk about. One is the compliance on paper. One is compliance governance, and then Alison's going to talk about work health and safety risk management. So under our model, we've got four elements there: hazard and incident reporting, systems recording, feedback and continuous improvement, and the potential use of external auditors or some form of external assurance. So compliance on paper. I have an audit background, and I'm sure many of you have met auditors during your lifetime. And auditors, the first thing they'll say to you is, can I have the documentation in relation to your system? So this one's quite well known, and most of us now have systems and documentation which ensures that all the elements of the Act are met under our documentation. But it's worth having a look at in your organisation to make sure that the compliance on paper, so what we mean by that is whether it's electronic records or whether it's actual documents, whether it's policies or procedures, have all been reviewed to make sure that they are compliant with the requirements under the Act. So then we ask simple questions like, does the system have all the mandatory elements? So do we have compliance in relation to how we're communicating in relation to work health and safety, how we're consulting and how we're coordinating our activities? Are all our policies and procedures in place? And do we have very clear systematized ways of tracking hazards and incidents and ensuring they are reported? So the compliance on paper, we would say from our reviews with most clients that they are able to identify that. Some people are struggling, I guess, in finding a work health and safety system that, in terms of IT software package, that works for them. You don't always need it. You just need to be very clear on how you ensure that those documents all have some form of central location, such that if you are ever investigated, you have a very clear paper trail, particularly for hazards and incidents. This one here, though, is a different question, and probably one compliance issue that we come up with regularly in the work that we do with our client base, and that is, if we asked your organisation who is responsible for checking and signing off that the work health and safety framework in place is compliant and effective, most organisations don't have that on an agenda anywhere. They're not clear in their structure who is looking at that. They may say, oh, the work health and safety officer maintains the system, but if they're maintaining the system, they're not the oversight. You need another group who are very clearly sitting back and saying all the requirements under the Act, we are sure that our organisation is meeting those key elements and that we have a demonstrated process and structure for each one. So we've put a little poll together today, and Stephanie is going to run that poll for a moment. So I'd be interested, for those of you who are in attendance today, whether you can answer this question. Is someone responsible for confirming the framework is compliant, for making sure that you're assessing high-level risks and reviewing the work health and safety culture? So if you can answer that question, please select one. Yes, we're very clear in our organisation that we have either a committee or a person or the board confirming that the framework is compliant. They're managing that risk assessment and ensuring they're reviewing the culture. No, maybe you've got some elements but not all, or maybe you don't know. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that poll and we'll see what we've got online.
Thanks, and we'll close the poll shortly. I'll close the poll and share the results.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Okay, so you can see there, which is fantastic, that we have quite a good result there for yes, we're very clear in our structure who does all of that. So that was 60%. So, so that's a really great result for those organisations in terms of understanding. I'd suggest probably in the structure that part of the agenda for your Work Health and Safety Committee should at least be doing those things and sitting back from the actual operational work health and safety matters and sitting back and looking at the framework over. There are some of you who have indicated no, that you don't have that, and also 28%. So we're sort of 36%, a third, saying that we don't have all of those elements sitting there. So that's something that group can really think about in terms of what is the overall governance of our work health and safety structures and processes. And it can be quite an educative process for some of your executives in particular to sit back and have a look at it, that bird's eye view. Thanks, Steph. We'll go back to the slides. So there, in terms of work health and safety governance, in terms of compliance governance, we're really looking at 3 levels. So compliance fits within your organisation at these 3 levels. So that one in the red there that we're talking about, which is the overall work health and safety governance at the whole of framework level. Do we have a compliant framework? Is it fit for purpose? Is it actually working in our organisation? Have we sat back and said, is this practical? And is it working effectively? Are we getting good engagement from our people? Are we getting the reporting and the insights that we need? Are we seeing continuous improvement in the way that we're managing our work health and safety obligations? At the middle level there, it's compliance in terms of the work health and safety management system. So do we have a management system? So our committees, policies and procedures, training, PPE, etc., that is compliant with the requirements. And then you've got compliance in day-to-day. So how do we make sure that our HSRs, we have the right number, that we've got good consultation processes and communication processes in place? And then, of course, it's having a look at the compliance in relation to assessing the task-specific risk management and particular hazards in relation to key activities on a day-to-day basis. So when we're looking at compliance governance, it's at all 3 levels, not just down at the day-to-day operations in terms of looking at compliance. You know, are our activities, have we assessed the risks, do we have the right approaches to our work? It's looking at all of those 3 levels, day to day, the management system, and right up at the whole of organisation level. So work health and safety governance in terms of due diligence, I mentioned this at the start. So this is really important for particularly boards to understand that they have actually got to take steps to reasonable steps to acquire knowledge of health and safety matters, to understand the operations of the organisation and the associated hazards and risks with those operations, to ensure that the resources and processes have been put in place to eliminate or minimise risks. We don't see a lot of reporting on the level of financial investment in addressing work health and safety matters, but I have worked with a number of boards on risk appetite statements where we get them up to articulate their risk appetite in relation to work health and safety, and you know, quite reasonably, all of them have a target of 0, as you should under the legislation. But in terms of the governance of how we measure that, and how we ensure that the resources we are applying to known risks and issues is appropriate, is another element of an agenda to sit back and have that conversation with the board and management, or with your executive team if you don't have a board, to actually sit back and say, are we comfortable that we're applying the right resources to it? Have I taken steps to ensure that we have processes for timely information and we get to know about potential incidents, hazards and risks on a timely basis to enable us to respond? Have we ensured that we've got processes implemented to comply with specific duties under the Act? So have we made sure that our processes are compliant in relation to consultation, incident notifications, etc.? And then have we taken steps to verify the provision and use of those resources and processes? So how do we know that they are actually in place and working as effectively as we think? And so at that officer level, that's a really good checklist there to make sure that we've done that. So I'm going to hand over to Alison now. We've covered compliance on paper and compliance governance, and Alison's going to discuss work health and safety risk management.
Thanks, Alicia. So I'm just going to get this slide to move along to the next one for me. Oops, jumped one there. Okay, so this slide here provides an illustration of a really important point about WHS risk management. And one of the things that, as Alicia was saying, most organisations are really across the ground level stuff. So when we think about work health and safety, everybody thinks about having to do a risk assessment and there being safety signs everywhere, and I've got to put in an incident report and that kind of thing. So if we look at that green arrow at the bottom of the slide there, most organisations are really good at this kind of ground level view of WHS, where it's the day-to-day risk identification and risk management in the course of what each worker is doing within the organisation, and then reporting up about any hazards and incidents that are identified. But when we think about WHS governance, and again coming back to the obligations of the PCBU and officers, there needs to also be a top-down view as well, which we might think about as the bird's eye view, where you're looking at risk identification at a high level, and managing risks at a high level, and also monitoring the landscape in which your organisation is operating. And I've given some little words in quotes there. So you might think of it as the bird's eye view and the ground level view, or you might think about it as, you know, the workers are seeing the trees and the PCBU and the officers need to be looking at the forest. So if we look at the ground level of WHS that we're all very familiar with, where we get the hazard notifications and the incident reports, and some organisations hopefully are also looking at their injury data and workers' compensation statistics, doing some trends analysis, and that's all really important. But from a reporting perspective, what you end up with is a really, really detailed view. And that can be helpful in some respects, but it can also make it hard to see the wood for the trees, as it were. Also, if you're relying on hazard and incident notifications, that isn't necessarily well designed to help you pick up things that could have a really high impact but might be quite low probability. So, for example, if you've got an organisation with 100 staff of a mixture of ages, well, there is a possibility somebody might have a heart attack, and so it might be reasonable that you would have a defibrillator. But if you're relying on hazard and incident notifications, you know, you might wait till somebody has a heart attack to get one, which isn't really the way you'd like to be doing it. The other thing that's quite limiting with looking at things just at the ground level is it doesn't actually get you to look outside the organisation to see what's going on outside the organisation that might be going to influence your WHS risk landscape. And so that's where the PCBU and officers and the whole of organisation level WHS risk management becomes really important. And what we can see here is instead of the little ants, we're actually seeing the whole termite nest and also the world outside the termite nest. And so, for example, in this context, we might expect that the board or the senior management or the business owners are looking at things like what's going on in my industry or our sector, and what is the best practice guidance. And a really good example of this would be, for example, if you're a home builder, you might not have had any issues with your staff members or your workers getting ill from, you know, the artificial stone bench tops, but that's been a really big issue that's become identified across that industry, and there's been a lot of guidance being published about it by the various national health and safety organisations. Similarly, the sort of hot topics within the community, and COVID's a classic example of this. You know, COVID-19 was starting to be in the news late last year, early this year, and if you were, you know, so if you were looking out the window, organisations actually had a bit of time to think, oh, how are we going to handle this, and do a bit of planning and preparedness, versus if you weren't kind of monitoring the landscape, you might have only started doing something about COVID when the rules started to be applied by the government. Another really good example of those community topics are things that can have a really important impact on WHS within your organisation, but might really not be that obvious. So mental health and family violence are really classic examples of those, where if, for example, you had a predominantly female workforce, and we know that family violence predominantly affects women in Australia, is family violence something that we need to think about when we're sending our staff to work from home, for example? Do we need to put in some risk mitigation measures to make sure that our workers are safe when we're sending them out of the office? You know, with mental health as well, you know, you might not think of construction as an inherently very stressful activity, but we know that the construction sector and all workplaces that employ a large number of males, you know, men's mental health is a really significant issue in Australia, and the construction sector has one of the highest rates of suicide in the country. And so by having that awareness of what's going on out in our broader community can really inform the approach that you take to WHS within your organisation and help to identify risks that wouldn't necessarily show up just by sort of saying, oh, well, did we put a sign under the ladder, and how did we put away those tools, and is there a burglar alarm for people when they're working late in the office at night, and that kind of thing. Some other really obvious ones to ask is what does our organisation actually do? You know, are we involved in heavy industry? Are we doing a lot of road travel? Do we do a lot of interpersonal stuff where there might be, you know, rude customers or, you know, aggressive people we're trying to arrest or that kind of thing? So just thinking about the activities at a big picture level rather than at that individual task level. How do we do our work? You know, do we have people working at remote locations? Do we have people working on shifts? Who are our people? Are they young people who might be going out partying on the weekend and coming in with a few different types of hangover on a Monday morning? Do we have an older workforce that might have particular types of health issues? Those sorts of questions. And the hazard and incident reporting data is also a really important part of this picture. I certainly don't want to discount that, but it needs to be one part of the picture, not the only part of the picture that is considered in a risk assessment perspective. So this diagram here illustrates the link that ideally would happen between that ground level view and the high level view. And so you can see in the top row there that the PCBU and officers are looking at a whole of organisation perspective, and it's a strategic approach. And so what you want to be doing is kind of coming up with maybe say 10 or 15 headings of what are the key WHS risks for our organisation, our operations, our workforce. And that's based on those external and internal inputs that I just mentioned in the previous slide. And then there are linkages down through the management and WHS committees to put in place policies and procedures that relate to and help mitigate those risks and also communicate about those things to workers. And then at the worker level, you want them to be aware of what are those top 10 or 15 risks you've identified and also be following the relevant policies and procedures. But then they also provide you those inputs around hazard and incident reporting from the ground level, which can then inform your hazard and incident data analysis and trends identification. And obviously linked in through all of this is also your consultation and communication mechanisms, but I've just focused in this slide on the mechanisms that exist for identifying risks at that level. The last point I'll make about WHS risk management is, again, coming back to what Alicia was saying about having effective reporting. So, you know, you want the reporting you want to have some regular reporting to your managers and to your executives or business owners, but it's also really important to have ad hoc reporting. So if something out of left field or a really significant incident occurs, you need to make sure there's a process for that being pushed up the line quickly and not waiting, you know, for the next end of month meeting or something like that. So having processes that are fit for purpose from both a routine perspective as well as the out of the ordinary. And that's tied in also to having escalation protocols. So knowing what things you should be calling the CEO at, or you should be ringing the boss on the weekend, or you do need to tell the board about, rather than just putting it through the normal pipeline. And then the last one there is about risk registers, and we don't have time to talk today about how to put together risk registers, but the key point I want to make there is about making sure that they're fit for purpose. And we do a lot of work with risk, and you don't want to have a risk register that's the size of a phone book and sits on a shelf gathering dust. You need to have a risk register that people are aware of and that it lives and breathes and it gets referred to often. And the best way to make that happen is to have it be a tool that is actually useful and helps people to do their jobs and can help inform decision making, but then also gets updated as part of those continuous improvement processes by information as further information comes to light. And to do that, ideally, you need to have buy-in to that risk management process at all different levels. And that's why one of the reasons why in the previous slide there, I talked about having the workers being aware of what those high-level risks are, because they're the headings that are on your risk register. So I'm going to hand back to Alicia now, who's going to talk to you about WHS governance and culture.
Thanks, Alison. So our last ones for this webinar today is just touching on that last point in our framework around culture. And in terms of what culture is, it's our shared values and beliefs. And interestingly, I think the second part of that is probably the most relevant to us, that it gets expressed through behaviours, customs and practices that collectively we display. So when we're talking about work health and safety, what are the behaviours and customs and practices that we collectively as an organisation display in relation to work health and safety? So the two elements that we just wanted to highlight to you today was two of the critical elements to building culture in a practical kind of way. And the first one is transparency. So organisations where work health and safety issues are very transparent, their responses from management and the board or the executive team or the owners about what is being done about work health and safety, what we're thinking about, a little bit aligned with what Alison's talking about in terms of the key critical risks to the organisation and how we're responding, that builds culture. So if people put in some kind of hazard and incident report and are never actually contacted personally, they don't understand what happened to it, they never see the feedback loop, over time you'll build a culture where people think that it doesn't matter if they do it or they don't. If you never talk about the board or the executive team talking about work health and safety, it puts the message out there in the culture that senior members of this organisation aren't really that concerned. So the first one there is we would encourage you to think about how transparent you are in relation to work health and safety and whether it's actually very front and centre in both positive and potentially clear around when you're addressing issues back to the people in your organisation. The second one there is behaviour at the top. And we all know this, we all know that culture is led from the top. But the key thing here is the absolute impact that I've seen in so many of my organisations about how staff genuinely learn by observing and responding to the behaviours, attitudes and systems that they see around them. And they're making decisions every day about how important work health and safety is in their organisation by what's actually happening on the ground when they see either their supervisors, managers, or very senior people in the organisation interact with it. So we always use the quote there, the standard you walk past is the standard you teach. So we, in some of the boards, we've started reporting on attendance of executives and board members in safety briefings. We try to understand how board members and senior executives are conducting themselves when out on sites to try and understand that actually when we are there as senior members of the organisation, people are picking up very important subtle cues on how important work health and safety is. So those two issues together, the transparency and how the senior people in the organisation conduct themselves have a huge impact on culture. And the last one there is accountability. So challenge your organisation. What actually happens when a safety policy or procedure is breached? And for many of the organisations that I have worked in or worked with, even organisations that have very mature work health and safety systems, if you actually dig down, there might have been some kind of verbal discussion. There may have been some form of, management meeting where that was unacceptable. But if you actually looked at what actually happened, what were the consequences for those particular issues, some of them are very light on. Now, there's a balance there between playing a heavy-handed approach and taking a continuous improvement approach. So, for example, if there are breaches by staff members which are deliberate and ongoing and consistently outside of organisational policies and procedures, then that would be obviously a clear one where there needs to be some fairly hard accountabilities there in terms of allowing that person to continue to operate in that activity. However, accountability can be broader than just top down. It can be us together. So for some of the boards that I'm involved with, we actually sit down when we have a significant work health and safety hazard or incident or near miss, and we sit down together and say, how do we make sure that we do better next time? Because we are all jointly accountable for making sure that something actually changes. And we list actions and we jointly hold each other, both board and management team, accountable for ensuring that happens. So accountability, if there's nothing that actually happens or changes when these situations occur, you'll build a culture where until something dreadful happens, nothing changes. So being really clear about accountability is a great way of building culture. So Leis, in summary, we've got there the espoused or intended values. If you're really, really strong with your organisation, you will be very honest and say, we have a lot of intended values. We have mission statements and values and work health and safety policy statements, etc. But let's be really clear about what our values are in practice. What do leaders do when a work health and safety issue is raised? How do they behave? Are they accepting? Are they supportive of staff in raising the issues and ensure that something's done? How do we behave when nobody's looking? And how do our systems ensure that people feel supported to enable continuous improvement with work health and safety? So there's our summary diagram for you to take away today. I guess the key things we really wanted to highlight to you in terms of the really critical findings that we find with our clients a lot. One is, who is signing off that your work health and safety framework is compliant, fit for purpose and working effectively? Make sure there's somewhere in your organisation and some time applied to sitting back and really having a look at the framework for work health and safety in your organisation. The second is risk assessment. Make sure that the risk assessment is both at that landscape view and the ground level. If we can see potential risks over the horizon outside our organisation, we're much more likely to be able to implement proactive work health and safety systems, which is the intent of the legislation. And the third one there is really culture means everything when it comes to any of these obligations under the Act. And our behaviours at the senior executive level, board level, management supervisor level, they demonstrate every day the importance or not of work health and safety in our organisation. So building a culture from our senior people down, showing that we're accountable, showing that we're interested, showing that it is a continuous improvement, transparent system, we're all in this together, can really build great work health and safety outcomes. And on that note, we're happy to finish. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Alicia and Alison. So please, everyone, submit any questions that you have for our presenters today via your control panel in your questions window. And just to remind everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the Worksafe Tasmania YouTube channel in the coming days. A question has come through. What are your thoughts on the verification of competency for compliance, and can an organisation rely on externally verified tickets to demonstrate competency?
That's a very interesting question. We're doing quite a bit of work on competency-based learning in different formats at the moment, and look, it's not an ideal framework in terms of ticking off. I think the risk assessment of the task that you're undertaking is really, really important. There are some licenses, tickets, etc., which are quite straightforward, and they're good quality providers in the marketplace, and there are people that are doing a very good job of actually checking practically that person is competent under that ticket. For based on your risk assessment, for higher risk tasks, I don't think it's effective just to rely on some form of external assurance or some form of license. and there needs to be some form of assessment on an ongoing basis internally for that particular task. Now, depending on the sophistication of your organisation, for some of the larger ones, it can be embedded in training that is ongoing in the organisation, where people internally and externally can provide a collective view of a staff member's capability in terms of that task. But smaller, it can also just be supervisors having the ability to feedback through performance reviews, near misses, hazards, or some kind of discussion, documented discussion with their staff member around their assessment of the person's competency to undertake that particular task. And we encourage organisations that just because they have a ticket doesn't mean they always undertake the task in a way that's acceptable, either from a safety perspective or in terms of how your organisation wants to undertake that particular task. So I had one recently on a board that I was on. So the employee had all the tickets and they'd all been confirmed and ticked off, but their behaviour and their activity on a day-to-day workplace had been inconsistent with that for quite a period of time, and none of the work colleagues had reported that issue up until we had an incident. So I think it was important for us to sit down as an organisation and say, okay, well, this person had all the tickets, they'd had it all signed off, but still weren't undertaking that task in a way, and people did know. So we had a big look at how we can encourage all of our staff members to interrupt the activity, or potentially if they can't get any traction with the employee, how they escalate effectively.
I'd just also add one there as well, is that even if people have got qualifications to do a particular activity in general terms, it can also be really important that they have that contextualised training in your organisation. And a really good example of that is in relation to, for example, we've been doing some reviews of organisations' response to COVID-19, and quite a lot of our clients are large organisations where they have people who've undergone formal incident management training. But we did see some organisations where somebody had incident management training and experience from outside, but they didn't know their own organisation's incident management framework, and therefore they weren't able to manage the incident effectively until they had that organisation specific knowledge. And I imagine the person who's asking the question, you know, you would also be looking at, have we trained them in our own SOPs? But that's a really important factor as well. Yes, they've got the ticket, but have we given them our local training as well?
Thank you, Alicia and Alison. Another question, what are the risks for a new CEO to a business that identifies large gaps in WHS work health and safety governance? There is that awkward period between commencing improvements and those improvements being realised. How would the CEO be protected, defended at this time?
Yeah, look, that's quite a common issue when senior executives come into an organisation and see potential gaps, and particularly sometimes there's an education process with board members as well who have perhaps assumed that things were fine, and then somebody comes in and says, look, there's actually gaps. The key thing with work health and safety is to demonstrate that continuous improvement loop. So the critical thing there is the timeliness of being able to demonstrate that you have identified the gaps, that you have engaged with the right people and consulted on the gaps, and that you have a plan of action in place, which is a reasonable and practicable plan of action to address the issue. If you have immediate dangers, we all know that you need to address those immediately. But from a governance perspective, some of these issues can take a little bit longer to engage and a little bit longer to implement. So the key thing is to make sure that you've documented the gap and you've documented the plan of action, and that you can demonstrate over time that you are making progress towards that plan. Taking everyone on the journey, I always say to boards, you know, no board has it perfect. No board can make sure that everything is perfect in their organisation all the time. But if they can demonstrate through their meeting minutes, through their strategies and through their plans, that they are continuously improving their organisation. If there ever is an investigation, they have quite a strong defence there that they were always taking opportunities to continually improve their organisation.
Thank you, Alicia. And just a reminder, there's still time to submit questions to today's presenter, Alicia, Leis and Alison Merridew for today's presentation. So please submit those questions via the questions window on your control panel. A question that has come through: what qualifications should an external WHS auditor have, for example, to audit fire evacuation, general workplace safety, etc.?
So again, from our perspective, this is really important to make sure that you're targeting that experience to meet the risk that you're trying to audit. So for example, we're an appropriate provider for work health and safety governance because that's our expertise, and we're very clear that we won't be giving assurance on operational work health and safety responses on the ground. So in terms of assurance providers, it's really important that they have, as Alison suggested, industry context and that they're pitched at the right level for the risk that you're actually trying to get assurance over. So for example, if it's signage and movement within an industrial zone, then you need an assurance provider that has demonstrated expertise in managing work health and safety in industrial zones. So it's not going to be all that helpful to your organisation to get generic people. Likewise, it won't necessarily help you if you have somebody who's very, very good on the ground in that industrial zone trying to advise your board on what appropriate meeting minutes, etc., might be appropriate to demonstrate their work health and safety obligations. So I would suggest a panel of providers and target those to the expertise and risks that you're trying to manage.
Thank you. And another question: what have you seen as the best ways to manage people working safely and in accordance with the safety procedures? How is the best way to cover this in the WHS management system?
So they might like to clarify the question in case I haven't quite heard that correctly. But in terms of the best ways I've seen to help people engage, the worst ways I've seen is to do desk-based learning about procedures. So in terms of people engaging, we use adult learning principles. So adult learning principles of actually doing and learning on the ground, and it's actually the effectiveness of that learning depends also on the supervisor and management capability to be able to demonstrate and show ongoing commitment and continuous improvement in real time to the person who is learning and engaging with the processes and systems. So where organisations have tried to sit their people down and say, hi, this is work health and safety training, we haven't seen that be all that effective. However, if we've seen organisations where work health and safety is just embedded into everything that they do, they talk about safety in all their articulations and all their supervision and all their encouragements. Well done, I saw you operating that really well. That was really great that you considered that particular safety issue. Staff have the ability to learn with real-time feedback with their supervisors and managers. So the investment level sometimes at that supervisor and manager level is really important so that they understand that a lot of the learning about safe practices happens in the small moments every day and not so much in taking their staff out and sitting them aside and going through the task outline. But more than happy if I've missed the point of the question for you to clarify if needed.
I'd just add on to that as well, going back to what Alicia was talking about with culture, that transparency and accountability. I think the again, sort of how not to do it, the thing of failing to communicate and consult is that's a really big risk in terms of engagement with WHS, and conversely, if you do that really well, and that's one of the reasons I think why it's built into the legislation, is if you actually have everybody talking about safety and being engaged and consulted about safety, they're much more likely when they get that feedback loop happening and they hear back from managers and leaders when they report something up the line, they get an email back sometime later or a conversation sometime later saying, oh, this is what we did about it, thanks for raising the issue. That in itself is such a powerful engagement tool compared to if you log something and then never hear about it again. Yeah.
Thank you, Alison and Alicia. A question, should a CEO sit on or chair a work health and safety committee to demonstrate that work health and safety is important, or is it better for the CEO to sit off the committee to allow space for the committee to present thoughts?
That's a really great question when it comes to governance and membership of these committees. So as the person who's asked the questions highlighted, there's two ways to think about it. In terms of the PCBU, quite often CEOs are obviously included within that definition. Now, one of the core pillars of governance is to not have people overseeing themselves. So if you think about that as a core principle, if the PCBU is heading up the committee, which is checking everything, and then is responsible as the PCBU for making sure that everything's working effectively, they're effectively overseeing themselves. So we quite often encourage organisations not to have the CEO chair the committee. Absolutely, in terms of demonstration of importance, can attend and should absolutely be engaging with staff, management teams on the issues of work health and safety. But to allow another executive or another senior manager to chair the committee and undertake the work of the committee in confirming the framework, in checking the compliance of the framework, to be making sure that the hazards and incidents and reports have all been addressed and that they're comfortable, such that there's a separation in the executive team in that oversight space. So I think you can possibly achieve both. Really importantly, think about the membership of the committees and don't have all the senior executives on the Work Health and Safety team and on the executive team that's overseeing the Work Health and Safety Committee, because it's the same people. So get some separation there, but there's nothing to stop those senior executives attending or promoting messages of safety throughout the organisation in every interaction that they have.
Thank you, Alicia. And with no further questions coming through, we'll close today's webinar. So thank you, Alicia, Leis and Alison Merridew from WLF Accounting and Advisory. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, WHS Governance, Building Culture, Capability and Compliance. At the close of this session, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate you providing us with your feedback. Today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the Worksafe Tasmania YouTube channel. On behalf of Worksafe Tasmania and the WorkCover Tasmania Board, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Alison and Alicia.